Delta Goodrem and back to your heart. Now, Hampton Court. Most people listening to me, if you're listening in London, will have a connection with Hampton Court. And it won't be one of my latest recollections of driving Vanessa Feltz back from a Tom Jones concert. And she had the plaid blanket that we were all given in the back of my Mini. But that's how this place reinvents itself, an amazing place. But Hampton Court has been a place of power, scandal and intrigue, a stage for events that shaped the nation. Now a new book called The Palace raises the curtain on 500 years of British history with royals, politicians, criminals and geniuses all playing their part. I am so pleased to say that the author of this book is a name that you will recognise because he's a regular contributor to Chewing the Fat. He is Gareth Russell, and the beautiful book is called The Palace, From the Tudors to the Windsors, 500 Years of History at Hampton Court. Gareth, welcome.
Oh, Joe, it's so nice to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
And we've both actually, because we've only seen each other on Zoom, because Gareth, since the pandemic, we seldom ever have people here in the studio. And you first came on the show after the pandemic.
Yep.
So we've not seen each other standing up. And I am so short and he is so tall. But I like to think I play taller than I appear.
I've been told I play shorter, so we can meet in the middle.
Oh, it's lovely to have you here. Hampton Court. So I always was told, because as I said in my introduction earlier on, I've done quite a few outside broadcasts there, and occasionally the girl, you probably know who this is, who's in charge of what I call the wardrobe department, but it's not. It's where all the costumes, the clothes are kept. Occasionally they'll have something, and she'll say, "Come on, Joe, come over and have a look," and it will be Henry VIII's hunting hat or something, which if she takes out of its wrapping could literally
disintegrate.
Do you know what I mean? So I'm so honoured but it's only happened a couple of times, Gareth. You've obviously been given access, far more access than I have. But I assumed it was Cardinal Wolsey, this is what I thought, that built Hampton Court, but it wasn't, was it?
No, it wasn't at all. So, well, first of all, I'm just going to say that the book ends with the current Princess of Wales, and I'm incandescent. I didn't know the Vanessa Feltz story to end it with, but, we put our dreams away. So, no, it wasn't. That's what's really interesting about it. It has a much older history, so it's such a good spot on the river, and bear in mind, the upper classes always wanted out of London, even when it was Londinium. So there was a villa there under the Romans way, way back. But the manor as we know it, it was that uniquely medieval crossover of warrior monks who owned this manor, and they rented it out. And in the 1490s, they started renting it to a guy called Giles Daubeny, who also was tall, and was a favourite of Henry VII. And he was so influential, he ran the royal household, that they gave him a very generous lease whereby he could alter the house as he saw fit. It was a lifetime lease. So most of the palace, as you see it, well, particularly the Tudor bit, is Cardinal Wolsey, Henry VIII's chief minister. But the kitchens, which if you're going, anyone who's going, go to the kitchens.
Kitchens are amazing.
Heart of the home, I believe, but also they have soot still on the walls and 500-year-old beams. I mean, you feel in those kitchens, and the staff do a great job, by the way. They light the fire on cold days and sometimes turn the spits, which just makes me hungry because sometimes they roast the meat on it. Wow. It's very atmospheric.
Yeah.
You get this sense, Joe, that like you could have people walk in with their Tudor, it could become a functioning Tudor kitchen again in a heartbeat, and that's what I love about it. But those kitchens, they were built for Lord Daubeny, and they fed Henry VII in 1500 and his wife in 1503, which is where the book The Palace starts. So yeah, it has a medieval history. It comes into national prominence just at that point as the medieval period starts to yield to the modern period. So it was a wonderful place to start it.
So how much has been added onto it? I mean, that beautiful Tudor timbered look that we see. Are there extensions all over?
Totally, yeah.
They've done it well, though, haven't they?
They've done it. It is the most beautiful form of historical Tetris you will ever see. And so the bit that you come into, that red brick, that kind of Tudor timber you're talking about, that used to be the whole thing. And we owe that to Cardinal Wolsey and also to his nemesis, for want of a better, Anne Boleyn, had this grand vision of how to turn it into sort of the cutting edge of architecture. And she'd been educated in Europe, and she had these very chic ideas of what to do. sadly, of course, she didn't live long enough to see this wing. But the wing that was installed for her once it became a palace when Henry VIII confiscated it from Wolsey was the Queen's wing and the private apartments wing, and it didn't weather as well as the Wolsey bit did. And in the 1680s, William III and his wife Mary II thought this is a bit tatty round the edges, very much neglected is how they politely put it. But they had lived in the Netherlands where all their homes were modern and warm, and they inherited all these English palaces that were huge, impossible to heat, and they were very uncomfortable. So they tore down that Queen's wing and they replaced it with an answer to Versailles, which is what you see today.
Right.
So if you're approaching from the home park, that sort of grand facade, that Baroque facade, that's them. So
there's no trace of Anne Boleyn's design at all.
There's one tiny little bit, which is quite moving actually, and also one of those stories that if you pitched as fiction, someone would say that's ridiculous. She used her Irish family, the butler, the Earls of Ormond. She used their crest. Her grandmother was an Irish aristocrat, and she had these white falcons that decorated her rooms. And when they were removing them after her execution, some workman obviously popped one out and kept it as a souvenir. And an antique dealer recently found it at a car boot sale.
No.
So Tracy Borman and Lucy Worsley, who oversee a lot of it, they have created an installation. They've brought it back to Hampton Court. So it's in the Great Hall, which she would have known, which is quite moving. This is what Hampton Court has. It's all this broken detritus of people's hopes and lives and dreams that just litter across it. So it's wonderful.
Absolutely. And did you say in the book, is it where the first royal wedding took place there?
So it's the first royal wedding it had was Henry VIII's. So it's
not to
it was Catherine Parr. It was his sixth wife he married there.
Right.
So you can still see that room. That room just made the cutoff from the demolitions. So he married her. So royal weddings really before the 1920s, not totally, there was one or two big ones, but they were generally small. They happened in small chapels. Coronations were big. Christenings were big. Weddings, for some reason, weren't. And Henry married Catherine Parr just off the haunted gallery. So he married his sixth wife in a room next to the gallery that's said to be haunted by his fifth. So there's
so Wolsey, I mean, doesn't it show how much Wolsey paid himself that he could, that a member of the clergy could afford a palace like that? And I've forgotten this bit of history. Henry VIII took it from him.
Yes.
With the intention of living in it originally, or was it through spite, or did he desperately want to live there?
Both. It was this nice cocktail of desire and pettiness, and he then lent on the monks to turn the lease into a freehold and give it to him, and in return he gave them this tiny priory in Essex, which was like the worst swap in history. It's as if someone says, do you want to give up your first class seat in British Airways for a tricycle? It's it's not even close to a fair exchange, but that's how it becomes a crown property. And it was because Wolsey failed to secure the divorce or the annulment of Henry's first marriage to Catherine of Aragon.
Of course, yes.
Yeah, so it's really, and again, you have all these great extraordinary people who live there, and I loved writing about them, but also part of the joy was finding out about servants who worked in the kitchen or ladies in waiting, and sort of just the way this place has so much politics happening, but also things like, by the way, you're not allowed to wear that kind of hat because Queen Jane Seymour hates it, and you have to make sure to use this kind of bedding, and this is how you make chocolate for George I. It has a lot of the everyday in it, which was really enjoyable to write about too.
And I think that's what we love in a book like this, when you get all of that, the detail that you're never going to hear anywhere else. Did Elizabeth I live there?
She did. She nearly died there. So in 1562, by this point she's 29. She's only been on the throne. She just turned 29. She's only been on the throne for 4 years, and she contracts smallpox. And she sort of feels it coming on when she's writing a letter about French foreign policy, and she tries to walk through the gardens of Hampton Court because they have this thing about the humours. You sort of shock your body into feeling better. Doesn't work. And she recovers. It takes 12 days. She loses the ability to speak. The whole kingdom's plunged into crisis because they have a young, unmarried, childless monarch who comes next, and she's no siblings. It's a fraught, and that the council gather at one end. You can still see the council chamber they gathered in, where they try to debate which which royal cousin is the best replacement to Elizabeth, and also Hampton Court's most, if you're a believer in the supernatural, prolifically cited ghost, which has the slightly Harry Potter-esque sounding name of the Grey Lady, was Sybil Penn, who was one of the ladies in waiting who nursed Elizabeth, caught the disease and died at Hampton Court. God. So yeah, it's really, and Sybil's ghost is allegedly opposite what once was so you have this tragedy, and then she's right opposite what was called the House of Common Ease, or the Great Ease, which was the Loo Block. Everything in Hampton Court, you go from tragedy to comedy and importance to the everyday, but just by turning a corner. So that was one of many things that just meant writing about this was never even remotely boring, Joe. It was just always interesting.
And if you, just reading and listening to you, it was literally, is it the most, I don't know how to put this, family-loved palace in the country? Because I had no idea all these generations lived in it. I loved Anne Boleyn because I used to watch Anne of a Thousand Days.
One of my favourite movies of all time.
Oh my God, can I just tell you this, Gareth?
Yeah.
I have to tell you this. Anne of a Thousand Days. When I was at school, Horsham High School for Girls, we were taken to Penshurst Place and they were filming it. And that, Genevieve Bujold, when she's by the fountain and she lifts her hands up, we were all behind the hedge being told to keep quiet, and we watched them film that. And I loved Anne Boleyn. I just felt so sorry for her.
That was the movie that started my whole interest in history, because my
loved it.
Dad was a great Richard Burton fan. So and we were in an absolutely rained out holiday in the south of Ireland, just one of those Irish summers where you get them in England too, where there's just no hope of the sun. Yes. So RTE, the broadcaster, was running old movies, and I watched it and was obsessed.
Oh, it was
from
fantastic.
That point on. And there's a great interview with Genevieve Bujold where she talks about it, and I thought it was the most interesting analysis of Anne Boleyn I'd ever heard, where she said that she found Anne Boleyn was apparently an extraordinary singer and dancer. So Genevieve Bujold was trained as a dancer, and she looked at Tudor dance moves, and she said, if you start a movement, you finish it. And she was like, that's Anne Boleyn. Whatever movement you start, whatever the cost, you finish it. And I thought
so
that was
true.
Yeah, isn't that a brilliant
Absolutely
analysis?
True.
Yeah.
And when she does that final for 12 Days I Loved Him, and it's the most wonderful monologue. So she lived in Hampton Court. I had no idea, honestly, until I started reading your book. I had no idea that, because I thought Hever Castle.
Hever was her natal home, was sort of her Althorpe to Diana's Buckingham Palace, if that makes sense. That's kind of it. But I've been fascinated by Anne Boleyn for years, and it was a real joy to do this third chapter. The third chapter is focused on so every chapter is a different room, different person, different decade, moving through the years at Hampton Court. And Anne's was one of the ones I really found joyful to write, because part of the excitement, for me anyway, was you see these really famous people come into Hampton Court, but they look different when you view it from this prism. The Anne you see here is someone who's full of confidence for the future, and she's chic, and she's a great mind for architecture, and it's all about these hopes that she channels into brick and mortar and glass and marble. And then by the time you come back for chapter 4, she's gone, and it's a young lady in wait. It's the opening quote I picked. I found right. It was probably I was like, I have to find something, and then it just appeared in a really tragic novel called Bowen's Court, that's written by a member of the Irish aristocracy, and Elizabeth Bowen, and she was left with her family home after independence, and there was no money. And it's all about what it's like to maintain this house as everything's gone. But the quote is, with each death, the air of the place thickens. And that's what Hampton Court is, just all these layers of hopes and life and death that have happened there.
Wow. You summed it up so well. You obviously went there a lot as a historian, do your research. I've just been there with this radio station, basically, and the last time we went was by boat. And if you think, so many of these people, members of royalty the servants, loads of them must have arrived by boat through what I call the back door, because the front is that awe-inspiring front that you go over the bridge when you come out the station. That's what I love when you go to Hampton Court.
That view as you crest the bridge.
Unbelievable, isn't it?
Yeah.
But many of them will have arrived by boat, and I think that adds a whole different dimension to the place, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And it's so interesting you say that, because initially my editor and I, Arabella, who's brilliant, we were sort of umming and ahhing, just having a talk really about where do you start when you've all these stories. And the story that we started with is, which I didn't know again until halfway through research, the late Elizabeth II had her coronation ball there in May 1953. Amazing. And also what I found quite interesting was the Queen Mother had an event in London, and she made sure that Peter Townsend got an invite to the other one, so he wasn't dancing with Princess Margaret at Hampton Court. But their approach was over that bridge. So we thought in the end, well, the river is how a lot of the people in the past would have seen it.
Yeah.
But Elizabeth and Margaret, and Prince Philip at the time as well, they drove from Buckingham Palace over that bridge. So I kind of wanted, first of all, I love the story of the ball. But also I thought it was really interesting to have them coming from Buckingham Palace. That is kind of our Hampton Court now.
Yes, I was going to say that. But is it though? Buckingham, it doesn't have the layers that Hampton
doesn't have
Court
the layers
has.
And also royals loved Hampton Court. And I've searched long and hard for a single Windsor that has loved Buckingham
Palace is like an office. It's horrible.
Yeah, it is.
Listen to me. I was only allowed in once and did that awful thing of photographing the toilets, which are like wooden seats. They're it's apparently hay boxes.
Apparently just miserable. It's just a cold.
It's so miserable. And it's like, sorry, this sounds so disrespectful. I adored the Queen, but she's no longer alive. But it was like that fading red brocade, and everything was like fading and damp. So it's awful.
Yeah.
And you just think, how could anyone live here with any joy?
Well, you can't. And that's also why you find things like the current king. I mean, he's kept the Queen Mother's former homes, the Clarence House and Castle of May, all of which are by any standards luxurious, but they're smaller. And you start to see really in Hampton Court a really interesting move where they build, for instance, the Great Hall. Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn build it, and then Henry VIII never really uses it because it's cavernous and it's freezing. So it becomes the canteen. They just put up trestle tables, and the staff bring their food up from the kitchen because they're all fed by the royal household. And it's not really until the Stuarts, who I have to say were probably the most fun to write about, because the Stuarts are just the right amount of demented.
Are they?
Oh, they're so unhinged. But they, but in a really there's just James I's lover, alleged lover Philip Herbert, is dancing a mask in the Great Hall. But they've sewn so many jewels onto his costume, he can't do the dance move.
Joy, what joy! Oh my God, and are all those outfits, are they all there? Because as I said, I was given privy to this.
Yeah.
You'll know who she is. She's this wonderful woman who's keeps all the archives of all these outfits, and she opened this box and she just went, I'll let you look at this, but we can't take it out because it will start to rot
immediately. Yeah.
And it was Henry VIII's hat with the plume, which he's in a lot of the portraits wearing them. And she went, there you are. And I was just staring at this thinking, oh my God. And they're all, this is priceless stuff.
Well, that chapter about the bejeweled for Sir Philip not being able to stand up, the Stuarts used the Great Hall for their first Christmas when they accede from the Scottish throne to the English. And the Great Hall all of a sudden becomes, that was the point where I was like, oh my God, so much happens in 12 days. What am I going to do? Shakespeare premieres 3 plays there in those 12 days.
What plays?
He did
the history plays.
He did the first, we think, fully what we would now know as the edited version of Hamlet.
Wow.
And he picked Denmark because James I's wife Anna was Danish. He picks Elsinore because they honeymooned at Helsingør, which is Elsinore in Denmark. He later picks Macbeth. Obviously, James I is Scottish, and I think it's his shortest tragedy and second shortest play. And Anna's brother, King Christian IV, comes to the Great Hall to see it and gets so drunk he falls off his throne and has to be carried out midway through Macbeth. But he does Twelfth Night, and he does Troilus and Cressida and Henry IV and Henry V, one night after the other.
I had no idea.
But on the subject of the clothes,
in the Great Hall,
and so they will have been rehearsing. You walk up and that's where they were rehearsing. Wow. Before they staged it. And then they started doing the masks, and I found these glorious accounts of how they installed, moving mountains, and they had the page boys in silver, so when they held the torches, it glinted. But on the subject of the clothes, Anna of Denmark arrives, and I Anna of Denmark was like a soap opera character, like the Alexis Carrington, like everything was just bigger with Anna. And she was in a play about her called The Vision of the 12 Goddesses, and she played Athena, and her 11 fabulous friends played the other goddesses. And Anna wanted the best costumes, so she said, get me Elizabeth I's finest dresses, and they cut them up for costumes.
You're joking.
Yeah. And that was the big reveal when she emerged from the moving mountain in the Great Hall.
Goodness.
Yeah.
That's sacrilege. Oh, my God. It was so disrespectful.
Yeah, she cut them, she slashed them to, but like, you know, so they were mid-length and didn't care.
Can I just, because we've got to finish in a moment and people need to read this for themselves. It is full of all these details. We haven't even spoken about the servants and how they got the food from A to B and everything. Because when you go there, you think, how was anything hot? How did anything arrive?
They put little private kitchens in. Anne Boleyn had a private kitchen installed, and so did Henry VIII, so that they could get their food also free from contamination.
How could he not love her when she went to those lengths?
I know.
Help design the place.
She's
keep
just
his
magnificent.
food. I think she was magnificent. So they had little private heated rooms. Gosh, that's it. Can we just talk very quickly about the gardens? Because I went to the flower show, and they, after Chelsea, I think they're trying to promote Hampton Court Flower Show so that it can be comparable to Chelsea, and it's much bigger and far more space.
It's just a gorgeous setting as well. It's just
amazing.
Magnificent.
And we were shown the oldest vine. I don't know if you see it. Oh my God, this vine, everybody. I mean, I dread to think if it ever died, because whenever there's a storm, I always think, God, I hope the vine in Hampton Court is going to survive this.
Well, and it's so physically impressive when you see it as well. George III he was the last monarch to live there, but he took a great interest in making sure it was kept. All the gardeners knew how to maintain it. And if anyone's interested, this is one of the other royals who lived there. The last Tsar's sister, Ksenia Romanov, lived in a house in the grounds of Hampton Court, and she used to love. They put her there because it would be impossible for the KGB to get that far inside the ground to kidnap her. But she used to love to go for a walk with the nun who lived with her to look at the vine.
Gosh, imagine the responsibility of having to keep that alive.
The sheer terror. Yeah.
And is it a knot garden? Is there a knot garden there as well?
There's knot gardens. There's the maze, of course, which is very... But also, if you go even how... So, for instance, the book ends with a visit from the Duchess of Cambridge, in 2016.
There's a lovely picture of her as well.
Oh, with the cake from Chocky Wocky Doodah, which is my favourite name for a
Brighton. It's a Brighton cake shop, Chocky Wocky Doodah. I've done loads of interviews with them.
Favourite name for a store I've ever encountered. It actually went it's mentioned overly much in the book. I just couldn't stop saying it. But she opened a playground for children to help with the young family demographics, but they built it on the side of the tilt yard, and they put Tudor iconography and heraldry in it. What historic royal palaces who run Hampton Court have done, for which I'll always be so grateful to them, is I think they've avoided what happened with Versailles, which is it didn't become cold. It still feels like a place.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it feels like a home.
Doesn't it?
I mean, that's a ridiculous thing to say. It's a palace. But you've explained why, all these layers of events and families that have lived there and loved it and added their personality to it. We haven't talked about the tennis court, and I'm trying to think, what films has that tennis court appeared in? Because it's a wooden tennis court, basically.
It's real tennis, which is like a savage squash.
Yeah,
it's probably the best.
Savage squash.
Yeah,
right.
It's the best way I can describe
I
it.
think what it was in. Was it in Chariots of Fire? It was in a film.
I think it was in Chariots of Fire. I think it was Chariots of Fire. You're right, and also the orangery and I think part of Queen Caroline's rooms. I could be wrong, but they were used to film The Favourite with Olivia Colman.
Oh my God,
fabulous Olivia Colman.
Yeah. There we go. Look, right, we've run out of time. You've got to read this yourself. It is out now.
Yeah, it is indeed.
So it's called The Palace, From the Tudors to the Windsors, 500 Years of History at Hampton Court. Fantastic endorsement by Philippa Gregory. Wow. We've been speaking to the author, Gareth Russell. There are photographs illustrating a lot of what we've been talking